It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said.
Earlier this year, reports circulating within senior royal household circles described a renewed internal review of archived materials held at Windsor Castle. The review, according to individuals familiar with archival procedures,
I think I eventually learnt that in horse trials and event riding, you should be sort of 85 to 90% in control of what goes on.
focused on a sealed section of records that had remained restricted since the late 1990s. These materials are understood to relate in some way to documents connected to Princess Diana's personal and institutional life, although the exact scope and classification of the files has not been publicly confirmed by the royal household. Within this context, Princess Anne is said to have played a central role in initiating access to the archive section in question. As a senior working member of the royal family with a long-standing involvement in charitable military and institutional duties, Anne has historically engaged with official records and archival systems as part of broader royal administrative oversight. According to those familiar with the internal process, her request was framed as a structured review of historically restricted materials rather than an investigative action. The archive section she requested access to had reportedly been marked as restricted since approximately 1997, shortly after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Records management practices within large institutions, including royal archives, often include categories such as restricted access, pending classification, or limited handling permissions. These designations are typically used to control sensitive material while decisions are made about long-term storage, privacy protections, or historical release. In this case, the section remained in a restricted state for nearly 3 decades, a duration that has drawn internal attention simply due to its length. After her request was submitted, internal approvals were reportedly required from multiple offices within the royal household structure. These included senior administrative and legal advisors responsible for archive governance and compliance. While multi-layered approval processes are not unusual for sensitive archival access, individuals familiar with the procedure suggested that the level of oversight applied in this instance reflected an awareness that the material could contain historically significant or sensitive information. Once approval was granted, Anne is understood to have visited the archive in person. The review reportedly took place under controlled conditions, with a small number of authorized personnel present, including an archivist and a legal advisor. No external observers were present, and there was no public announcement prior to or following the visit. This is consistent with standard practice for internal archival work within royal household systems, where confidentiality is typically maintained unless a formal decision is made to release information publicly. According to internal accounts described by those with knowledge of the review process, the materials examined during this session included a range of documents categorized under estate management, personal correspondence indexing, and custodial records dating back to the period surrounding and following Diana's death in 1997. It is important to note that the precise content of these materials has not been independently verified, and the royal household has not issued any detailed public statement regarding their nature. However, what has generated internal discussion is not a single document, but rather the structure of the archive itself. Sources familiar with the review process describe the materials as being organized in a way that reflects multiple phases of classification and reclassification over time. Some documents appear to have been logged, moved, or indexed under different administrative categories during the late 1990s and early 2000s, a period that included significant transition within the royal household following Diana's death. Within this broader set of records, there are reportedly references to custodial tracking systems that include names of various family-adjacent individuals. One name that has been mentioned in internal discussions, according to unverified accounts circulating within these circles, is Laura Lopez. At this stage, there is no public evidence or official statement confirming any substantive connection between her and the contents of Diana's archived materials. Her name, as described in these reports, appears only in limited contextual references within administrative logs rather than in direct correspondence or personal documentation. Because of this, Those familiar with the situation have emphasized that any interpretation of these references must be approached cautiously. Administrative records within large institutions often include names and procedural contexts that do not imply direct involvement in decision-making or access to sensitive materials. For example, names can appear in distribution lists, custody confirmations, or procedural oversight notes without indicating active participation in the underlying events. Following the initial review, Princess Anne is reported to have escalated her findings through internal channels within the royal household. This escalation reportedly involved briefing senior legal advisors and selected members of the institution responsible for reviewing historical archive governance. The purpose of such escalation, according to standard institutional procedure, would be to determine whether any materials require reclassification, further legal review, or potential preservation adjustments. Prince William is understood to have been informed of the findings during this early stage. Individuals familiar with the situation describe the briefing as factual and document-based, focusing on the structure of the archive and the nature of the records rather than interpretive conclusions. William's involvement in such matters is consistent with his position as heir to the throne and his broader public emphasis on modernization, transparency, and institutional accountability within the monarchy. At this stage, however, no formal conclusions have been announced. The materials remain under internal review, and no decision has been made regarding public disclosure, archival reclassification, or historical publication. This reflects the standard approach taken in situations where documents may contain sensitive personal data, legal implications, or reputational considerations for individuals still living. What has made this situation more closely examined within internal circles is the broader historical context of Diana's archived materials. Following her death in 1997, the management of her personal belongings, correspondence, and institutional records involved multiple legal and administrative processes, including probate administration and royal household coordination. While many of her personal effects were distributed according to her will, other materials were handled under separate institutional procedures, particularly those relating to her official duties as Princess of Wales. Over the years, questions have occasionally been raised in public commentary and private scholarship about the completeness of the publicly documented record of her personal and official archives. However, due to the private nature of royal household record-keeping, few definitive statements have ever been made about the full scope of materials retained within institutional archives. The current review, as described by internal sources, appears to be part of a broader effort to reassess historical classifications and ensure that archival records are consistent with modern governance standards. This type of process is not unusual in long-established institutions, where record-keeping practices evolve over time, and older classifications may be reviewed for accuracy, relevance, or compliance with current policy frameworks. Still, the length of time that the specific archive section remained restricted has drawn attention internally. Nearly 30 years without significant reclassification or public-facing review is unusual in most institutional contexts, particularly for materials connected to a figure of such public historical significance. This has led to renewed interest in understanding how and why certain classifications were maintained, and whether those decisions were purely procedural or influenced by broader institutional considerations at the time. It is within this context that the mention of overlapping custodial references has been interpreted cautiously by those involved in the review. As with many archival systems, references to individuals in administrative documents do not necessarily indicate involvement in underlying events. Instead, they may reflect procedural necessities, such as record tracking, document handling logs, or internal reference indexing systems used to manage large volumes of material. For this reason, officials and individuals familiar with archival governance have reportedly stressed the importance of separating documented structure from interpretation. At this stage, there is no verified evidence publicly available that confirms any personal or direct connection between Laura Lopes and Diana's archived materials. Any suggestion of such a link remains within the realm of internal review interpretation rather than established fact. Following the initial findings, further internal discussion was initiated to determine the appropriate next steps. This included consideration of whether additional archival sections should be reviewed, whether independent oversight might be required, and how to manage the sensitivity of materials that could involve living individuals or unresolved historical classifications. As of now, no public inquiry has been announced, and no official change has been made to the status of the archive. The situation remains contained within internal review processes, with limited access granted only to authorized personnel. What remains clear is that the review has prompted renewed attention within the royal household to the long-term management of historical records, particularly those relating to high-profile figures whose personal and public lives intersected with institutional responsibilities. Whether this leads to any formal disclosure or structural change in archival policy remains uncertain. For now, the focus remains on assessment rather than conclusion, and on understanding the full context of records that have remained largely unchanged for decades. Following the initial review of the sealed Windsor archive section, the situation moved into a second phase that was described by individuals familiar with the process as more structured, more restricted, and significantly more sensitive in terms of institutional handling. While the first stage of the review focused on identifying and cataloging the contents of the materials accessed by Princess Anne, the second stage centered on evaluating the implications of those materials and determining how far the archive record might extend beyond what had already been examined. According to those with knowledge of internal procedures, the escalation was not immediate in a public sense, but it was prompt within the royal household's internal governance framework. Once Anne completed her initial review, she is understood to have provided a formal internal briefing, summarizing the nature of the materials she had accessed. That briefing reportedly included a structured overview of document categories, archival organization, and historical classification patterns observed within the sealed section. The materials themselves, as described in internal accounts, included correspondence indexes, custodial logs, and personal documentation attributed to the period surrounding and following the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. While the existence of these categories has not been independently verified outside internal reporting, the consistency of descriptions across multiple accounts has led to increased attention from senior advisors responsible for legal oversight and archival governance. Once the briefing was circulated within the relevant internal channels, a decision was taken to elevate the matter to a controlled review group consisting of senior legal advisors and selected members of the Royal Household Administration. The purpose of this group, according to standard institutional practice, would be to assess both the legal sensitivity of the materials and the historical governance implications of their classification history. Prince William is understood to have been informed during this stage of the process. Individuals familiar with the briefing describe it as focused on documentation structure rather than interpretive conclusions. In other words, the emphasis was placed on what the archive contained in terms of recorded material, how it had been categorized, and how it had been handled over time, rather than drawing immediate conclusions about intent or responsibility. This distinction is important in institutional settings such as the royal household, where archival governance often requires separating factual record-keeping from interpretive narrative. The initial concern, according to those involved, was not to determine meaning, but to establish accuracy and completeness of the record before any broader assessment could be made. As the second stage review progressed, attention reportedly turned to the internal structure of custodial tracking systems used within the archive. These systems, which are standard in large institutional archives, record the movement, classification, and handling of documents over time. They can include references to departments, administrative units, and in some cases, individuals associated with document custody or oversight responsibilities. It is within these custodial references that certain names have reportedly appeared in internal discussions, including references linked indirectly to family-adjacent individuals. One such name that has been mentioned in circulating accounts is Laura Lopez. However, it is important to note that at this stage there is no publicly verified evidence confirming any direct involvement or role. The references, as described, appear to exist within administrative tracking systems, rather than in personal correspondence or substantive decision-making documents. Those familiar with archival systems have emphasized that the presence of a name in custodial logs does not necessarily indicate participation in events or decision-making. In many cases, Such references simply reflect procedural metadata, such as document transfer acknowledgments, indexing entries, or administrative oversight records. As a result, interpretation of these references requires careful separation between administrative function and historical implication. Despite this, the appearance of overlapping names within sensitive archival material has been sufficient to trigger further internal review. The concern within the royal household is not necessarily about the individuals themselves, but about ensuring clarity in how records were handled during a period that was already marked by significant institutional transition following Diana's death. The late 1990s and early 2000s represented a complex period for the royal household in terms of both public scrutiny and internal restructuring. The management of Diana's estate and associated materials involved multiple layers of legal, administrative, and familial considerations. While probate processes handled the distribution of officially recognized personal assets, other materials connected to her public role and institutional responsibilities were managed under separate internal systems. It is within this separation of categories that some of the current questions appear to originate. According to internal descriptions, certain documents may have been moved between classification systems or re-indexed under broader administrative categories during this period. While such processes are not inherently unusual in long-term archival management, the lack of complete transparency in historical documentation has led to renewed scrutiny in the present review. Following the escalation to senior advisors, discussions reportedly began regarding the potential need for a comprehensive audit of related archival sections. This would involve reviewing not only the sealed section initially accessed by Anne, but also adjacent or linked records that may contain cross-references or related custodial entries. Such an audit, if authorized, would require coordination between multiple offices within the royal household, including legal advisors, archivists, and senior administrative officials. It would also likely involve strict confidentiality protocols to ensure that sensitive information is handled appropriately throughout the process. At the same time, consideration has reportedly been given to how any findings would be managed from a public communications perspective. The royal household has historically taken a cautious approach to releasing information related to private archives, particularly where materials involve personal correspondence, sensitive family matters, or historical legal arrangements. Prince William's involvement in the process has been described by those familiar with the situation as measured and procedural. His broader public role has often emphasized modernization and transparency within the monarchy, but within internal discussions, the approach appears to be one of careful assessment rather than immediate action. According to internal accounts, he has requested that any conclusions be firmly grounded in documented evidence before any decisions are made regarding disclosure or classification changes. This approach reflects the complexity of balancing institutional continuity with evolving expectations around transparency. On one hand, there is recognition that historical records of public figures such as Diana carry significant public interest and historical importance. On the other hand, there are legal and privacy considerations that must be taken into account, particularly where documents may involve individuals who are still living or whose families remain connected to the institution. As the review continued, attention also turned to the broader classification system used within the Windsor Archive. The sealed section originally accessed by Anne was reportedly categorized under a designation that allowed for extended restriction without a fixed review date. This type of classification, while not uncommon in archival systems dealing with sensitive material, has raised internal questions due to the length of time it remained in place without reevaluation. In standard archival governance practice, long-term restricted materials are typically subject to periodic review to determine whether classification status remains appropriate. The fact that this particular section remained largely unchanged for nearly 3 decades has prompted discussion about whether procedural review cycles were consistently applied during that period. However, those familiar with the archive's operational history have noted that the late 1990s and early 2000s were periods of significant institutional adjustment. Changes in staff, evolving administrative priorities, and the sensitivity of the material itself may have contributed to delays or deferrals in standard review processes. While this does not in itself indicate wrongdoing, it does help explain how certain materials may have remained in restricted status for longer than typically expected. Within this context, the discovery of structured custodial logs and cross-referenced entries has become a focal point of the second stage review. The concern is less about individual names and more about whether the archival system accurately reflects the full chain of custody and classification decisions made over time. If gaps or inconsistencies exist, they could complicate efforts to fully reconstruct the historical handling of the materials. At present, no formal conclusions have been issued, and the review remains ongoing. The materials themselves continue to be held under restricted access, and no external disclosure has been authorized. Internal discussions are reportedly focused on determining whether further documentation exists that has not yet been retrieved or reviewed. For Princess Anne, her role in the process is understood to remain limited to providing factual account and procedural clarity regarding her initial access. She has not been described as taking an interpretive or advocacy position within the internal discussions. Instead, her involvement is framed as part of a structured, institutional review process designed to ensure accurate understanding of archival content. The broader implications of the situation, however, continue to develop. Within the royal household, there is recognition that any review of historical records connected to Diana carries both institutional and public significance. Diana remains one of the most widely recognized figures in modern royal history, and any reassessment of her archived materials is likely to attract attention beyond internal administrative circles. At the same time, there is a clear emphasis within the current process on maintaining procedural integrity. This includes ensuring that all assessments are based on documented evidence, that interpretations are carefully separated from factual record, and that any decisions regarding future disclosure are made through appropriate governance channels. For now, the situation remains contained within internal review structures. No public statement has been issued, and no change has been made to the status of the archive. The second phase of review continues to focus on verification, classification history, and the completeness of custodial records. What remains most significant at this stage is not a single finding, but the accumulation of procedural questions raised by the archive itself. How it was managed, how it was classified, how it remained unchanged for so long, and how those decisions fit within the broader historical context of the royal household during a period of transition. Those questions are now at the center of the ongoing review, and while no outcomes have yet been determined, the process itself has already shifted how senior figures within the institution are approaching the long-term handling of sensitive historical records. The next steps will depend on whether further archival material is identified and how the royal household chooses to balance historical transparency with institutional confidentiality in the months ahead.